Greetings, I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the called pastor at the Canton City Lutheran Parish in Canton, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Welcome to episode 34 on our Bible study of the Acts of the Apostles. We are going to be starting in chapter 23. For those of you who have just found this video series, you're welcome to start with this episode, or you can go back to the YouTube channel and start the series from the beginning. That is up to you. You're welcome again to stay in this episode and enter into other episodes as you desire. For those of you who are returning, welcome back. It's always a joy to have you with me. I encourage you to have a few tools available for your study time. One is a Bible, translation of your choice, digital, printed, whatever works for you, whatever you can have available. I also encourage you to have paper and then a pen or pencil. And those are for you to take notes if you're a note taker, to doodle, to write down your questions, your comments, your inspirations, whatever. If you think of a task that you need to do later, jot it down. Whatever you need to use that tool for, I encourage you to use that. You're also welcome to pause the video as you need to do other things in your life and come back. However you find this helpful, I encourage you to use that. I believe that we are in control of our own education, and if something has really inspired you and you need to reflect on it, take the time to do that. As I'd mentioned, today we are starting in chapter 23 at verse 23, and we will begin chapter 24 ending at verse 9. Paul has just been in the trial from the Sanhedrin. He was taken back to the tribune's barracks, and they were preparing to flog him. He then revealed to the leader of the soldiers that he was a Roman citizen, which put a quick and immediate stop to that. And now we continue now with the tribune sending Paul to another authority in the Roman government to continue this hearing that is going on. But before we get into that, there are 6 themes that run throughout the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. We're going to review those quickly here, and then we will come back and see how those are touched on in our stories today. So first is God's redemptive purposes. Second, salvation for all alike. Third, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. Fourth, table fellowship. Fifth, the role of a disciple. And sixth, the importance of an accurate witness. So those are the 6 themes that run in and out of Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts. Not every event will touch on all of those themes, but let's see what Luke lifts out in our stories today. So we are first going to start at chapter 23, verses 23 through 35. Again, the tribune wants to just found out that Paul was a Roman citizen. He then hears from Paul's nephew that there is a plot to kill Paul, and the tribune hears this news and then is in the process of protecting Paul. So again, let's read those verses. Chapter 22, verses 23 through 30. Chapter 23, verses 23 through 35. Then the tribune summoned 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea, with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. And also provide mounts for Paul to ride, and take him safely to Felix the governor." He wrote a letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. But when I had learned that he was a Roman citizen, I came with the guard and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they accused him, I brought him to their council. I was found that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatris. The next day they let the horsemen go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belongs to. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrived. Then he ordered that he be kept under guard at Herod's headquarters. So we find that the tribune, Lysias, was concerned about Paul's safety in Jerusalem, so then sent him to Caesarea to be to the governor, who was the next person kind of in authority, and then put him under the governor's care. One, it removed him out of Jerusalem, but two, it put him in the care of someone who had more authority within the community. Now, it does seem extensive if you think about the number of people who were sent to protect Paul and escort him. First, they did it under the cover of darkness. It was 9 o'clock at night. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. This was not something that was going to move quietly and easily. But if you put Paul in the midst of all of that, most people, one, wouldn't attack. That's too many Roman soldiers, too many military people. The second part is Paul might actually disappear amongst the horsemen, not being able to identify him completely separately from someone else. Now remember, Paul is no longer a prisoner in the sense of he is actually in protective custody. He is, according to the tribune, not guilty of any crime, but he is concerned about the accusations the Jews are making against him, but he is also concerned about this plot to kill him. And as a Roman citizen, Paul is guaranteed the protection of Rome against those who might want to harm him. So this is part of what kind of this over-the-top response and what is going on. Now, just to give you a sense of how many people this would probably be, about half of the tribune's soldiers under his command. So he's sending a lot of people to protect Paul. So maybe this idea of this like overinflated guard contingent might also reflect kind of Luke's desire to say, Paul cannot die until he gets to Rome. Paul has to fulfill this will. There is nothing that will prevent Paul from doing this. And even Lysias, in his civic duty, is playing out God's will and God's plan. So there's no way that anyone is really going to attack Paul. So the tribune, as I mentioned, was really worried about these death threats that Paul was receiving, and he took these precautions, even if they were excessive, to make sure that Paul safely arrived at his destination, which was to the governor Felix. But also what's happening is the tribune's status as a soldier is also at stake. If he can't protect this man, then he also is potentially at risk for losing his position and his authority. So as we get to verse 26 and 30, Claudius Felix was a governor of Palestine and Judea from about 52 to 60 CE. So about 8 years. This is actually important. Remember, Luke, both in his gospel and here in the book of Acts, really tries to anchor these stories in historical moments, right? By naming who was the leaders in Jerusalem and all of those sorts of things through various times, connecting them to the Roman Empire, so that we had a sense of this is when it was happening. This is the historical moment. And this is actually part of Luke's desire to be an accurate witness. So historians outside of the gospel tell that Felix was a free man with considerable influence on the emperor. And so this letter that the tribune writes to Felix is carefully crafted. Felix has a great influence with the emperor, with the emperor of Rome. So he wants to make sure that he, one, addresses him in the proper way with all due respect, but also to make sure that that he, as the tribune, the letter writer, looks as good as possible. So if you really read it carefully, the letter does reflect what's happening in Luke, but it's also edited and enhanced in a way that makes it look like he didn't have any of the trials and tribulations, any of the flips. He never mentions that Paul was saved from flogging only because Paul mentioned he was a Roman citizen. He doesn't mention, kind of those foibles. Instead, he writes it in such a way that, like, look how I protected this Roman citizen. Look at how good I was. I called the council together, but they didn't have anything that was really worthy of putting Paul to death. So for Paul's protection and for the sake of the community, I'm sending him to you, and his accusers are coming so that you can hear this case as well. So again, it's very flattering to Felix. It is written in such a way that the tribune, Lysias, always kind of looks like he's the hero in it. But yet, throughout all of this, Felix, the governor Felix, and the tribune Lysias both become agents of God to guarantee Paul's safety to actually get to Rome. So it's very interesting how God places in circumstances and situations others who move forward the will of God, especially as we watch the opposite of that, where we have the unrepentant Jews and those who are accusing Paul and have been accusing other Christians of false things, trying to undermine the will of God. So in verses 31 through 35, upon arriving in Caesarea and reading the tribune's letter, Felix holds a primary hearing to clarify the issue of jurisdiction. So he actually speaks to Paul, asking Paul where he's coming from, to make sure that he is the appropriate governor to be listening to the case. And this obviously is also part of what's going on. So Paul's response that he is from Cilicia says that he is in the right place, he is with the right governor, and those who are coming to charge or to argue their case against Paul are actually in the right venue. So let me go back here a minute. Sorry, I misplaced my thought here. So Paul is in the right place for the venue. Felix says, yes, this is where you should be. Felix says, yes, we will have the hearing here. And we'll finish this hearing, or we'll have a full hearing when your accusers arrive. But then Felix also puts Paul under guard in Herod's headquarters. Now, Herod's headquarters, the Prudeum, is not prison. This is actually a multi-purpose building. It is both an official residence for the leader of the region and a venue for governance. also as the place where court hearings are held, a place that's rendered judgment. So though Paul is still a prisoner, he's held as a prisoner, he's unjustly been charged but waiting for trial. He is kept in a safe and comfortable place. So unlike other times when he's been falsely accused and thrown into prison, this is actually a relatively good place to stay. He's under protection, but he's still under guard, so he can't just leave on his own, because of course now Felix wants to have the trial to hear, I shouldn't say a trial, a hearing to determine if there is cause for charges, and if so, then what would be the consequences of that. So in chapter 24, verses 1 through 9, we begin kind of the second part of this legal proceeding, where now the accusers come and present their case to Felix. In our next episode, we'll hear Paul's response, but right now it's the charges that are being brought against Paul. So let's move forward in chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney, a certain Terullius, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullius began to accuse him, saying, "Your Excellency, because of you we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. We welcome this in every way, and everywhere with utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have, in fact, found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accused him." The Jews also joined in the charge by asserting that this all was true. So again, this is actually the first time that Paul is actually being held on trial. Again, hearings before the Sanhedrin are not civil trials. That is an internal Jewish matter amongst the leaders of the Jews, and conversation and judgment on Jewish law. This has absolutely nothing to do with civil law. So Paul is now actually having a formal hearing in front of the governor. He is being charged with a number of things, but some things to look at before we get into each of those. One, if you notice, 5 days after Paul arrives, now his accusers arrive. So there isn't a lot of time for his accusers to really prepare a case for him, but they do bring a lawyer. They bring someone to speak on behalf of them to the governor. His name is Terullius. We do not know if he is a Jew. Speculation is that he may not be, because he doesn't seem to be concerned with Paul's Jewishness or the Jewish law. He just talks about how Paul is causing agitation within the Roman Empire by causing conflict within the Jewish community. But there are 4 things that Terullius accuses Paul of. 1, he's a pest. 2, he's an agitator. 3, he's a ringleader of a Jewish sect. And 4th, that he tried to defile the temple. But yet there is no allegations or clear mention of Paul's mission to the Gentiles. But yet that his agitation among all the Jews throughout the world is still a theological argument. And it really presents a conflict within the Jewish community. It is religious in nature. It is not about the Roman Empire, nor is it political. And we'll see how Paul refutes those charges later in chapter 24. So let's be honest, we've heard all these charges before in the book of Acts, sometimes using different words or in different settings. But what we hear in this process is that this spiritual authority of Paul and his importance for the whole church is not going to end with Felix. He's not a criminal, he's not a maverick, he's not a madman, he's not selling snake oil, but nor is he an intellectual lightweight or religiously mediocre. He is Paul, a prophet like Jesus who speaks to the people of God. He lives faithfully to the laws of the Jewish traditions. He is blameless in religious and social practices. And so what ultimately happens is Paul will defend who he is and defend against these accusations that are made against him. But let's go back a little bit here, because let's think about the people who came to make accusations. One, Ananias, the high priest, which actually kind of says this is really important stuff that they're doing here, that the high priest is leaving Jerusalem to come to Caesarea to stand as an accuser in this particular situation. And then, of course, with some elders. Now, there's some question about who these elders would be. The guess is they were probably Sadducees, because remember when Paul was standing before the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees started to have a disagreement within the council because Paul was fulfilling all law according to the Pharisees, and he says, I'm being charged for preaching the resurrection. And for the Pharisees, there's nothing religiously wrong with that. For the Sadducees, there is. And so the belief is that these were probably Sadducees who came with the high priest to make these accusations or continue these accusations against Paul that are now brought before the governor. But I want you now to look carefully at how Tertullius starts out his opening comments to the governor who is hearing this case. Now, please note that he is actually conforming to typical rhetoric of the time. This is how you would start a legal argument in the ancient world. For us, we look at it and we go, oh my gosh, he is just shamelessly flattering this governor. He's trying to get the governor on his side by just, like kissing up to him so that he will make a decision against Paul. But the fact is this isn't uncommon. This would have been part of what would have happened. So for us, it might feel manipulative, but that's just part of how it was done. So regardless, Tertullius opens these remarks. He wants to establish a good rapport with Felix, again, hoping that he will get the results that he wishes. But Tertullius' description of Felix contributes to, this idea that Felix has this desire for the well-being of the community, and by being concerned about the well-being of the community, then he's going to hear these charges and accusations against Paul as one who wants to protect the peace of Rome. If you've studied history, you've probably heard of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And there really was something to that. The way that Rome ran and maintained the empire was to seek to keep peace by allowing local religions and collaborators in local areas to maintain peace in their own communities, as long as that peace was maintained, then those people would stay in power. So there was some benefit to Terullius saying to the governor, you're the one who's made it so peaceful here. You're the one who has helped us live in this peace. So when he brings charges against Paul, these accusations, it does kind of say to Felix, like, ooh, wow, I need to be careful. Here's an agitator, a troublemaker. He's causing dissension. Let's shut him down. So there is something to be said about kind of how Terullius works it. Obviously, it comes from a place of tradition. This is traditionally how it would be. Here's who you are. Here's who you are. And the accusations that I'm going to bring are going to bring into question what you've accomplished so far. So again, that is a big challenge. So one of the important things about these charges, these accusations, is that they all lead up to this idea that Paul is seditious, that he is trying to undermine the Roman peace, trying to undermine the stability of the community. So these charges of him being an agitator, of him being a rabble-rouser, for leading sects, trying to be the leader of a Jewish sect, breaking up the Jewish community, are all things that might cause trouble and that the governor is going to want to quash to maintain the peace. So ultimately, Paul is portrayed by Terullius as someone who is subversive and threatening the peace of Rome, and of course of this community. From the narrator's perspective, the third charge of being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene kind of brings some different meanings behind it. So the word sect that is used here is often used in a derogatory way. It's a pejorative. It goes along with the fact that Paul is a rabble-rouser. Luke actually uses this same term earlier in the book of Acts, in chapter 5, verse 17, when he's talking about Sadducees, and then in verse 15, verse 5, when he's talking about the Pharisaic, Sadducean and the Pharisaic parties. In the same time, this idea of a sect denotes a particular interpretive tradition within a wider, more inclusive religious order or a philosophical school. So it could be pejorative, it could be used in a more neutral way, but clearly in the way that it's being used here, Terullian is usually using it more as a derogatory statement. So that, he's saying this isn't someone who should be held in the same esteem as the Pharisaic and the Sadduceic groups. Instead, he's this outsider. He's of that sect. Probably kind of in the same way we would say, like, he's part of that cult, that has that negative connotation. And with that, then he's implying, Terullius is implying that he's really outside theological and moral and traditional boundaries for the Jewish tradition. But underlying all of that is that Paul is a troublemaker. That is the key thing. He is a troublemaker. He is going to cause problems. He's been causing problems. He's going to keep causing problems. So Paul is now being charged basically as someone who is just going to undermine the governor's ability to keep the peace, to rule, and keep safety within his territory. And again, this is always scary, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I think it's worth mentioning in Rome, in the Roman Empire, when you were given control over a region, part of your responsibility was to keep the peace. And if there were people causing peace to be disruptive, remember when the tribune heard about the violence happening in the temple, he sent in soldiers and centurions to remove Paul, to stabilize the situation. They're authority comes because they are able to work with the local people and to maintain peace. And if peace is not maintained, then they lose their position. So there is something to be said about the way Tertullius argues this and these charges against Paul. He's saying to Felix, be careful. This man is a troublemaker. If you notice, he doesn't really give good evidence as why he's a troublemaker. These are just the accusations that are made against him. So that's where we are. And of course, Tertullius says, interrogate him. Talk to Paul. Find out, find out from him why we're concerned. And then, of course, in verse 9, the Jews join in with Tertullius saying, yes, these are the charges. And they're just asserting all of this stuff is true. We don't necessarily hear particular evidence. But obviously, they're the ones who brought Tertullius. They're the ones who are going to throw their support behind him. But they are against Paul. And remember, Paul is a Pharisee. He comes from the Pharisaic tradition. So again, we truly believe that they were probably Sadducees who were part of this entourage. And they were concerned about his assertion about the resurrection of the dead, which again in verse 21 of chapter 20, which Paul will talk about again in verse 21 of chapter 24. But for them and at this time, those who have brought Paul charges and accusations against Paul really do believe that he is a threat not only to the Israelites, but also then at this point saying he's also a threat to the Roman Empire. So this is where we're going to end today. So Paul is moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea. He is quickly interviewed by Felix. Felix says, okay, I see what's going on. We're going to wait for your accusers to arrive. We're going to have a hearing. The accusers bring their charges, underlying all of this, that Paul is a troublemaker who's going to create and wreak havoc and cause chaos and violence, and he needs to be shut down quickly. This is where we're concluding. Let's go look through these 6 themes and see if if Luke uses any of these themes in our story today. So 1, God's redemptive purposes. Really not much to say here. Paul really doesn't have much of a chance to speak other than to verify his origin, where he was born and raised, so that Felix could determine whether he was in the right place for his hearing. 2, salvation for all alike. No, not again, but Paul really hasn't had a chance to speak. 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth are not the issue. 4, table fellowship, again, not the topic here. 5, the role of a disciple. A little bit. Paul is not uncooperative in this process. He understands that he is to get to Rome, so what's going on right now is just kind of a sideline to what he's actually supposed to be doing. But 6, the importance of an accurate witness. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Luke is determined to make sure that this telling of Jesus' life and the life of the early church is as accurate as possible. So again, placing people in situations where historical identifiable people are found, by naming other events that are happening or have happened that might be verifiable outside of Scripture story. So his desire to really portray an accurate witness, and even as simple as, the charges, these accusations against Paul, would be something that might actually have been charged against someone, especially if you thought they were going to be causing trouble and disrupting the peace. And again, even the lawyer who was speaking on behalf of the accusers used rhetoric that was appropriate and common to the time. So there's nothing like out of time or out of place that's happening in our stories today. So again, this was a little bit shorter one, but I wanted to spend all of next week in Paul's defense and while Paul is being held in custody, which is the rest of chapter 24. So we're beginning at verse 10 and going through verse 27. And I just want to make sure that we have time to really spend on that next week. So join us again at our next episode, which will be episode 36. Look at that, I've lost my place. 35, sorry, as we go into next week. As always, thank you for joining me. If you have questions, comments, reflections, feel free to post them in the comment section on the YouTube channel. I'll answer them as best I can. If you would prefer a more private conversation, you are welcome to email me or reach out to me on social media. You'll see those coming up here in just a moment. Again, thank you for joining me. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.